Hello, everyone. Hello, good to see you all. Good to see so many smiling faces. My name is Roger Narlock, and I'm director of the Benedict Institute, and I welcome you to our first Lunch and Learn of the semester. We are a bit delayed this year for obvious pandemic reasons, and so we normally do 3 of these Lunch and Learns each semester, and this is our first. Which means you have the wonderful opportunity we are still planning to do 2 more. So be sure to look at the daily bulletin where they will be announced so you can sign up for the 2 coming yet in April. As you know, if you've been to these before or if you're new, welcome. During these Lunch and Learns, we invite speakers to expound a bit on some aspect of Benedictine spirituality or Benedictine values and how they connect to life in our community and beyond. And with that, we have our wonderful guest with us today, George Maurer. But before he comes up to share his thoughts with you, I want to invite Dana Drazanovic, professor from the communication department, who will give an introduction of George.
Thank you. What a lot of people don't know is that I'm actually George Maurer's publicist, and for real, and I have been since 2007, I believe. And it's been my challenge and my pleasure to try to describe what George does concisely for 15 years. Okay, but here's where we started. George, when I started working with him, he was merely a musical performer, composer, and arranger. Now, George is a musical performer, composer, arranger, fundraising, international, cross-country, adventure, bicyclist, humanitarian podcaster, and multimedia interactive educational storyteller. For now.
That's a lot to fit on a name tag.
As I like to say, I speak George. It's the language. But if I've learned one thing about George Maurer in these 15 years of working with him, it's that the wheels in his mind never stop churning, just like the tires on his bicycle never stop turning, just like the Onkyo cassette recorder he used to duplicate his first music as a student here never stops spinning. I've also learned that everything he does is grounded in that one simple Benedictine principle that you're all familiar with: listen with the ear of the heart. Listening is at the core of George's work as a musician, for sure, whether he's arranging songs for the Minnesota Orchestra and Glacier National Symphony, or creating the original concept and score for a music theater performance featuring a conversation between Rainer Maria Rilke and Tennessee Williams with poems George set to music. His ability to not just listen but really hear has led George to a pretty amazing and diverse 35-year career as a musician. It started right here at St. John's, and it has seen him share the stage with everybody from Bobby V, Buddy to Holly's Crickets, Bruno Mars, to Eric Clapton, and Motley Crue's Vince Neil, who probably isn't the most Benedictine guy on the planet. He's played with the country band on an Ojibwa Nation reservation. He's toured with the Midtown Men featuring 4 original actors from Broadway's Jersey Boys. He's led the George Maurer Jazz Group for 25 years and released 20 albums on his own label, Pine Curtain Records. He's been awarded 2 McKnight Composers Fellowships, among many other grants and awards. More and more, George's musical work reflects a broadened worldview, one that delves into the beautiful diversity of people and the undersung experiences that help shape the country and the world. An example would be one of his current projects. It's called Empire Builder, and it's a musical that tells the story of a Native American man who's been called back to the reservation by his dying grandfather. For that, George can thank his epic bicycle rides. Listening is also at the core of those rides, which have taken him across the United States, Canada, Iceland, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Patagonia, and Chile, and Argentina, often by himself. I feel good when I go on a 25-mile bike ride and George rides 100 miles a day. It started as a fundraiser for cancer research in the name of his late friend Carolyn Held, the wife of St. John's alumnus Patrick Held, who's right here. The first ride was across the 48 contiguous states in 48 days, was actually inspired by George listening to his own inner voice, which was telling him to challenge himself and to push his physical and mental limits as he looked for a way to honor his dear friend. Those rides quickly evolved as George met people along his route and realized he wanted to be more than just a tourist passing through. He listened to those people he met along the way: Muslim fishermen in Sri Lanka, war survivors in Vietnam, artists doing community redevelopment in Newfoundland. Listening helped George see the connections that human beings share, that we're not so different after all, if we would just push past the walls that seem to separate us. He started recording those stories and creating podcasts to share his experiences with others. Then came the pandemic, and there went live music performances and travel. George did a pivot. He turned his biking experiences into live online multimedia interactive educational presentations with the hope of inspiring K-12 students to broaden their worldviews and push their own boundaries. To date, he has presented his Tales from a Bicycle Seat program to more than 10,000 students across the US. But all roads seem to lead George back to CSBSJU, where he learned so much about the importance of listening. He worked here as an admissions counselor and advisor to the diversity orientation program from 1988 to 92. He served a term on the alumni board, taught 2 music business courses, and has provided countless entertainment for many, many events. The George Maurer Jazz Group collaborated with the St. John's Boys Choir for Boys on Broadway fundraiser for 15 years. George also composed the raucous Johnny Anthem that plays over the loudspeakers at Clemens Stadium before every home football game. This semester, George is a resident scholar at the Collegeville Institute, working on some interesting projects he'll be telling you about in a minute. Please help me welcome today's featured speaker, musical performer, composer, arranger, fundraising, international cross-country adventure bicyclist, humanitarian podcaster, and multimedia interactive educational storyteller, George Maurer.
Had to do that. Thanks so much, Dana. I feel like I should have a football helmet on or something. I feel more comfortable behind a music stand, so that's why we've got that here in front of me. When a jazz musician improvises, they're allowing their voice to express whatever is stirring in their soul, free of rules, regulations, or any filters. It's that freedom that drives improvisation, the freedom to speak. When a jazz musician speaks through their music, they're saying, I will tell you how I feel. I will show you who I am. I'll be vulnerable in front of you. I will speak loudly and clearly. But before a jazz musician is free to improvise, to speak, they first have to learn how to listen. We can all take a lesson from jazz. What are you listening to? Said the man at the front of the classroom. Tell me, kid, what are you listening to? It was January of 1985. I was 19, and I was sitting at a piano bench in a course titled Jazz Improvisation, and the guy asking the question was Don Malloy, who was a jazz musician from St. Cloud. He'd been invited to speak to our class by our instructor, an educational professor named Dr. Ed Murray, who looked like Doc Brown from Back to the Future. Ed would give me weekly early morning jazz piano lessons in the Great Hall, right after breakfast, and his breath always smelled of coffee and eggs. Both Ed and Don taught us that if you want to be able to improvise, the very first thing you need to know how to do is to listen. In particular, you need to listen to other musicians who are around you. You listen first so that eventually, if your timing is right, you can join in with them on a musical conversation, which is the goal in jazz. And if you listen well enough, an improvised conversation can go pretty much anywhere. But first, you have to know how to listen. So tell me, kid, said Don, what are you listening to? Up until that moment, I had assumed that I already knew how to listen. I've been playing by ear all my life. So why did I need to take inventory on what I was listening to? Why was the what so important? Well, in 84, 85, one album that all of my musical friends and I were listening to was a thrilling breakout album by the artist Sting called Dream of the Blue Turtles. And on that album was the most amazing keyboard solo I had ever heard in my life, played by a jazz pianist named Kenny Kirkland. In fact, I was so moved by this incredible piano solo of Kenny's that I attempted to transcribe it by ear, to write it all out, note for note, so I could play it just like Kenny. I remember spending hours upon hours with a pencil and some staff paper and my Onkyo cassette deck, reviewing every few seconds of the cassette at a time, then rewinding the tape and starting all over again, over and over, 4 or 5 notes at a time, hours upon hours, trying to get that solo written down. I couldn't wait to finally be done writing out the entire solo so that then I could be Kenny Kirkland. I want to play just 90 seconds of that solo. It's a 5-minute solo, but here's the first 90 seconds. You get the picture. He goes on for another 3 minutes before he's done talking. And I thought I could sound like that if I just wrote that out. What was I even thinking? In that solo, you can actually hear Kenny saying through improvisation, this is how I feel. This is who I am. I'm showing you who I am. And at the age of 19, I was definitely not aware of who I was. I certainly hadn't lived the life that Kenny Kirkland had lived in order to be able to create an amazing solo like that in the first place. Even if I could have written that solo out and then learned how to play it, at best I would only be mimicking Kenny's voice. And on top of all of that, I would need to ask Sting if I could borrow his band so I could really sound it the way I wanted it to. That was out of the question, so I formed my first band in college. So what did Don Malloy mean when he framed the question that way? What are you listening to? The implication here is that you can't just listen over and over to the things that you already know. You can't play it safe and expect to grow. In music, that's called a feedback loop. You have to listen beyond what you know in order to grow, which is a concept I teach in my school shows for the Tales from the Bicycle Seat program. Well, being here at St. John's and St. Ben's, I was in the right place for that growing to happen. It was around that time when I was 19 that I met a Benedictine monk named Mark Tamert, who taught me that one way I might grow would be to listen to poetry, in particular to the poetry of the great Austro-Bohemian poet Rainer Maria Rilke. And in 2009, Mark and I and my jazz group curated an evening of original jazz and poetry at the Dakota Jazz Club. Jeff Engholm here, who has been my musical friend for many years and brother, was there that night. And here's Mark reading part of a Rilke poem that evening that I first heard him read in a German class that I took my freshman year.
I would like you to think of yourself as that young poet, that young creative person that you are. Think about the creativity in your life, the way your creativity has shaped your life. This piece comes from Rilke's wonderful novel, The Notebooks of Malte Lohritsbrücke, and it's just a paragraph of the young artist pondering what it means to create. For the sake of a single poem. Poems amount to so little when you write them when you're too young. You ought to wait and gather sense and sweetness for a whole lifetime, and a long one, if possible. And then, at the very end, you might be able to write 10 good lines. This is from a poet who had already written hundreds of poems.
Rilke, through this poem, is saying also, so what are you listening to? To live a life of creativity, Rilke says, don't just listen. You have to feel and experience what it is that you're listening to. even if you might not fully appreciate what it is. And you have to have many of these experiences, says Rilke, a whole lifetime of them, before you can create anything of substance. Benedict's rule also echoes this. I've set up 1 million events in this room when I was working for Summer Events Crew, summer of '86, and I always looked at this big piece of art on the wall that has the word listen on it, which is from Benedict's rule. Listen with the ear of your heart. Benedict adds, hear keenly and sensitively the voices of persons and all created things. That's interesting imagery, isn't it? Hearts with ears. Why did Benedict use such imagery? The reason we listen with the ears of our heart is because our heart is where the truth resonates. And the truth is what calls us to action. So with my remaining time here, I'd just like to give you a few broad brushstrokes on how the Benedictine concept of listening with the ear of the heart has influenced my creative life and called me to action. It was the summer of 1993, and I had just finished a 9-month tour performing across the United States, and I was about to take a gig on a cruise ship in the Caribbean and spend the rest of the summer on a cruise ship, making a lot of money, enjoying the sun, the whole deal. And a friend of mine said, oh, instead I volunteered you to work on an Ojibwe Indian reservation called Turtle Mountain up in North Dakota. And I said, you what? So I found myself interviewing from a Wendy's in Wichita, Kansas with the director of this youth program, still thinking about that cruise ship I could have been on. And within my first week on the res, Bobby Joe Parisian, who was the band leader of a local Ojibwe country western band named Heartbreak Station, found me and asked me if I wanted to join and play piano with them. And I said, sure, I have always wanted to join a band of Indians. Don't worry, I ran that past my indigenous friends. They thought it was hilarious. I got the gig. Word got out on the res that I had joined this band, and from then on, folks on the res started referring to us as 4 Indians and a white guy. Indigenous humor is a lot like monastic humor. One day, the local Benedictine priest, Father Ray Guy, from the Benedictines of Blue Cloud Abbey in South Dakota, gave me a tour of the res. And as we were passing the church cemetery, Father Ray asked me if I might guess what the average age of all of the Ojibwe males buried in the cemetery was. I thought it was an odd question. 75, 80, I said. 46, he answered. When I asked him, why so young? Ray reminded me of the legacy of the erasing of indigenous culture over many decades and centuries, forced enrollment in Indian boarding schools, and other injustices that had led to a legacy of broken families, alcoholism, mental illness, suicides, all directly connected to the life expectancies of these young souls in St. Anne's Cemetery. I had only ever read about this, but to be in a place where it was happening all around me was a completely different perspective. And I would think about this a lot during my weekly gigs with Heartbreak Station and with my daily work with the kids on the res. I could feel myself changing and being moved. I wanted to do something about all of this, but I didn't know what to do. At the end of that long summer, among my new Ojibwe friends, I found it difficult to go back to my relatively uneventful life and not feel like I could just forget these things that I had seen and heard. It wasn't until 15 years later that these experiences, with the help of my friend, a singer-songwriter named Jack Gladstone from the Blackfeet Nation, and lyricist Ann Bertram and I came to fruition when we created a theater project called Empire Builder, which is the story of Sky, named after a little kid on the reservation that summer. Sky, in our story, is a Native man who's been called back to the res by his dying grandfather, who put him in the foster care at the age of 9. Sky takes the train west. The train becomes a time machine, taking Sky to major junctions in his family's past and transforming the way he sees his grandfather and the traumatic event that separated them. This is just a little bit of the music of what Sky gets to sing that I got to compose for that project.
Grandfather's dying. Grandfather wants me. Now that he's dying, Grandfather wants me. I will be there. Take me there. When I wanted him, where was he? Never mind. When I needed him, where was he? Never mind. I will be kind, I will be strong, I will be big. I will be there. I will be kind, I will be strong, I will be there. Like he never was. Never mind. Take me there. Take me
That's Paul Diethelm on guitar, Julie, if you recognize that. Creating Empire Builder was one way that I could commit myself to finding a way to help make change happen, by using my art to help amplify stories and voices for those who have been historically marginalized in our democratic society. Here's another story. This is Brother Louis, 1984 again. This is my freshman floor faculty resident, who's a World War II vet named Brother Louis Blankner. He always wore sandals with no socks, even in the winter time. He always called me Greg instead of George. And for years, he taught medieval English here at St. John's. By 1987, which would have been my junior year, Minnesota had witnessed its 100th death from an epidemic known as the AIDS epidemic. Due to rampant stigma of AIDS associated with being gay, people with HIV and AIDS had started losing their jobs, started losing apartment leases, friends, and even the love of their families. And so Brother Louis quit teaching English. And he, with the help of this Benedictine community, opened what would become Hennepin County's first adult hospice for people who were living and dying with HIV/AIDS. It was a 4-room house in South Minneapolis, and Brother Louis lived in one room and took care of the residents in the other 3. He shopped, he cooked, offered friendship, and provided medical care with the help of nurses and doctors. It took a lot of guts because most people at that time believed AIDS could be transmitted by regular contact. But that didn't stop Louis. He was committed. Louis had listened. His heart had resonated with the truth of what was going on, and that truth had called him to action. In 2016, I got to channel only a fraction of Brother Louis' compassion when poet Sierra DeMulder and I were commissioned to create 4 new choral works for one-voice mixed chorus, the world's largest GLBTANQ choir, which is based in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And our artistic response is that a part of the composition process that Sierra and I went through, the first thing that we do is we committed ourselves to listening. We sat down, and particularly we sat down with transgendered youth and listened to the stories of their struggles, having been kicked out of their homes or beaten up in school hallways. Sierra and I both resonated with many of these stories out of our own experiences. From these stories came words and poetry that Sierra created. I received those words the day after the 2016 election and got to work right away. This is one of those compositions, just a small portion. It's called 50 Candles Burning, and it's arranged for string quartet and one voice. This is just the opening page of the score, and I'll play a little bit of it here from our premiere at the Ordway Theater in St. Paul. I just want to draw your attention to just a couple measures of this composition. I've circled some symbols in red. They look like the letter F. This is a dynamic marking in music. We call it forte, which means loud, with intensity. You can see some red marks that look like scissors that increase that to a much larger level. Also, you can see in the strings and the piano and the choir, all of us are singing a big stacked block chord with that same amount of intensity, even with these little check marks like this, which also means to give a punch to the sound. This is about as loud as I could get to describe what it's like musically to be slammed into a locker. And I knew exactly what this felt like, because that's happened to me before. Composition allows my voice to express whatever is stirring in the soul, free of rules, regulations, or any filters. We'll do a little switch here. This is Carolyn Held. She's the wife of Pat Held, class of 73. Carolyn, in the summer of 1988, a school teacher from Little Falls, Minnesota, decided she was going to bike across the United States from Seattle to Boston. She had never ridden more than 100 miles in her life. But here she is in Toronto by this stage of her journey, raising funds for the Boys and Girls Clubs in Little Falls. And this journey taught Carolyn so many things about herself that she was doing big things later on in her life, like at the age of 70, learning how to play baseball at the Twins fantasy camp while battling cancer. She moved her chemotherapy appointments around, and after Carolyn died, I decided I was going to bike across the United States and follow Carolyn's journey.
Be safe, George. All right.
Pat dropped me off in Seattle, and it took me the same number of days. Many journeys since then. This is my friend Michael, who's a Siberian Russian, who I met in Iceland and said bike across Sri Lanka with me. Vietnam. My friend Washington, who, when he found out my name was George, said, "Together, we are George Washington." Gave me the flag of his country, Chile, as a sign of our friendship. These are stories that I tell during my Tales from a Bicycle Seat program, and the reason I bring this up is that there's a particular thing that started happening to me with my listening on all these bike journeys. And this particular story I want to tell you about is a graphic artist from Newfoundland named Pam Hall, who her project was about going into communities and interviewing every single person in the community and listening to them, and then transferring their knowledge to an encyclopedia. She called it Encyclopedia of Local Knowledge. Because as communities disappear and die and so on, knowledge leaves with people. And to solve some of our bigger problems in the world, we need some of that knowledge at the table, not just science, not just government, but we need the knowledge of everyday people. So this is Pam talking a little bit about listening.
Finding out who knows what where is pretty straightforward. You ask questions of everyone you meet on the ferry, at the gas station, at the coffee shop, and on the wharf. You go to events like Farm Day, or the Harvest Festival, or Hooking Night at the Artisans Guild. Everyone you speak to knows something, and knows others who know something. One person leads to another, and eventually, if you're persistent, lucky, and your timing is good, you get to speak to people at length and in detail about some of their knowledge.
Amen.
You will never get to talk with everyone, so you learn to listen well to those you're lucky enough to meet with. Everyone knows about their place, knows how to do things, and remembers some of their community history. There is so much expertise that you can never capture more than a little of it. Mapping knowledge is about listening and luck.
There's that word listen again. I'm coming to the end of my time here, but I want to say that my time here in Collegeville has been spent doing a lot of listening. I spent last summer composing new music in Iceland on an island, and while I was there, I was paying particular attention to how climate change is affecting coastal communities in the North Atlantic and the Arctic and other places in the world, and I would see a lot of this on my daily bike journeys on this island. This is about 1 o'clock in the morning, by the way, because we're up very close to the Arctic Circle. I decided that I wanted to create a project that would take the voices of polar explorers and those who have approached the poles and use those as a way to describe how those types of people who went to the poles came together with limited resources to form a community in order to get through a harsh environment, the way that we all have to keep continuing to learn how to do this. And so I'm going to be going back to Iceland this coming year to work in this community, to listen and gather stories with the recording gear that I carry on my bike, and to turn those stories into what we call sound walks. And I can't go into what those are right now in too much detail, but basically you'll be able to hear those stories anywhere that you walk. So I've been at Collegeville Institute here since the beginning of January, working on my Unfrozen project. It's been a wonderful opportunity because I've been all around St. John's campus. If you've seen some guy on a fat bike along or in the middle of Lake Sagatagan, that's been me doing some of those gathering of sounds from the environment. I have been dropping microphones down fish holes in the middle of the lake, out in the middle of the Sag during blizzards, recording howling winds and sounds, and of course thoroughly enjoying the St. John's campus and all that it offers me. So this is a project that will continue to develop and evolve because I have to do a lot of listening in order to do this. I would always park myself out at 4 o'clock in the afternoon because the local Stearns County boys would come and drill their fish holes, and this allowed me to do something a little bit different than them. I would be dropping microphones down into the water to record underwater sounds. So I'm going to close this out by saying that I found Kenny Kirkland's transcribed piano solo on the internet recently. Think about it, I could have saved myself a lot of time. Of course, that means I'd have skipped all the listening that Don Malloy and Ed Murray and Mark Tamert and Rilke and Benedict were telling me that was so important. And I've been lucky, I've been given the gift of 1 million chances to listen over 50 years on a piano bench and a bicycle seat. And like the experiences I heard in Kenny Kirkland's piano solo, my experiences have become a part of my blood. They're the ink on the scores, the complex rhythms, haunting melodies, and the roadmap of chord changes in hundreds of songs that I've been lucky enough to write. So, after all of this, if you feel moved that you want to learn how to improvise, I'm happy to help you with that. First, you need to know how to listen to others who are around you. Difficult to do nowadays when so many of our conversations are reduced to this. You listen first so that eventually you can join in with someone on a real conversation. And if you listen well enough, that conversation can go pretty much anywhere. But first, you have to know how to listen. Here are some tools to help you with that. First, take inventory of what it is that you listen to. Our hearts cannot grow, cannot be moved by the truth found in the struggles in another person's soul if we don't try to listen beyond what we think we already know. Next, sit down with somebody you don't know or maybe don't understand or differ completely with, whether it's politics or religion or of a gender that has no box yet to check, and practice listening to their story. Do this today. Listen long enough so that you can eventually transcribe that unique story. It'll be like transcribing a solo. It'll take repeated listening so not to miss a note. Listen with the ear of your heart to that story, and perhaps you'll be moved by that story. In time, maybe you'll be changed by it. Become an advocate then, like Brother Louis, or Carolyn Held, or Don Malloy. And this is how we all move forward together. We can all take a lesson from jazz. So tell me, what are you listening to? Thank you for having me here. We just have a few minutes left before I know some people have to leave for the end of lunch, but if there are any questions that any of you want to ask, the Benedict Institute has asked me to let you know that there is a microphone that can float around the room, or you can just stand up at your table, but for the helps of our listening audience, it'd be great if you had the microphone. You're welcome to ask me any questions if you want.
George, why don't you tell us about the next project in Iceland in more detail?
The next project in Iceland will involve me immersing in the community of Harisi, Iceland, and spending a lot more time capturing the stories of these citizens who live in this town. I'm waiting to hear on acceptance to a grad program in Iceland that will start this August. And in that program, I will be learning all about what makes these communities tick, biology of fishing, the economics of how their government works, all the things that will inform me on how to ask questions of people so that we can archive those questions, those responses, that knowledge that these people have. And the way we'll map that knowledge is I will then, my goal is to work with Icelandic poets and Icelandic musicians and only work as more of a facilitator rather than using my composer's voice in this. I want their voices, the music of their culture, the words from their culture to create these opportunities to listen to these stories. We'll be installing them in Soundwalk, which are basically sound files that are floating in the air that when you have the right app on your phone and you walk into a zone where I've dropped a sound file, it will automatically start playing in your ear and it will tell you a story. And what it is that you see around you in the environment will connect with what you're hearing. So phone's in the pocket, you're out and looking around. It's like a museum tour, except it's outside and it's connected to the everyday things that you see in a community. So it's complex. I'm waiting to hear, and even if I don't get into the grad program, I'm still going to Iceland to start this work, and we're already working with that community. So, any other questions? Yes?
What made Iceland be the place? I mean, you've traveled all over. Why Iceland?
Why Iceland? I went there for the first time when I was 50. I just had such an amazing experience that I felt I wanted to go back. And so last year in February, even though we didn't know where we would be able to travel in the summer because of COVID, I found an artist residency there on this island, and there was a loophole in the Icelandic government site that said if you're on a residency, you can come in from the United States to be here. So there were supposed to be 4 artists in that same old schoolhouse that I was in. None of them showed up, so I had this old schoolhouse all to myself. The people on the island called me the man with the bicycle. And I remember I broke through the ice one day when I was at the local restaurant every evening that I went to give my business to. And the fisherman who ran the ferry service tossed his car keys to me and said, "You need a haircut." And I didn't say thank you, I didn't gush, I just said, okay. And he says, when you get to the other side, just click the button and whichever car lights up is mine. And so I went and got myself a haircut the next day and got a few winter clothes, came back, filled his car up with fuel, tossed the keys back at him. And I was drinking whiskey with him last summer when I found out that I'd won the McKnight Fellowship for the second time. I said, you could pour another shot, we're gonna celebrate. So I go to Iceland because if you can break through an Icelandic person and get to know their interior, then this can hopefully be applied to anywhere, so, yeah.
I understand that when you ride bikes, you meet people, but is there something else about pushing your body that affects your listening somehow?
Well, you certainly are concentrated on either an earworm that's in your ear for an entire day. I've had many collective unconscious earworms in my head, or music from Jeff Engholm's new album always was running through my head last summer. But that sort of tightens my focus because you're scanning the road, you're always looking ahead, you're looking for dogs that are noticing you and wondering what they're going to do, stuff like that. So you're primed to listen when you're on a bike. Arch over here, who's one of our Collegeville Institute folks, he's an avid bicyclist too. He knows all about the listening process as well. So for those of you that have to leave, no problem, go ahead and do that. But if any of you want to stick around and ask more questions, I can take them up here. Or perhaps we got room for one more question. Yes?
I imagine that you spend a great deal of time at your piano. Do you have any favorite songs that you just always gravitate back to that you like to play?
No, not really. I actually try and not go back to stuff that I already know. I do that enough once a year when we have our holiday show at the Paramount. We're always trying to switch up at least 40% of the set list. But I kind of always feel like I need to keep pushing something new. So I really try not. People ask me, who's your favorite piano player, who's your favorite this and that, and I'm like, I have no idea, because I've just kind of have always, you know. There would be a pile of burnt CDs in the back of my truck because I would learn songs for funerals and weddings and rehearsals, and as you learn them and you get done, you flip them like a frisbee to the back of the vehicle. And once a year I would clean out all of these CDs that were floating back there because I was never going to listen to them again. I would never learn those songs again. And so that's part of the process is just sort of like listening as much as possible. So, good question though. Yes.
When you're on the bicycle trips, do you have the ability to perform sometimes, just kind of spontaneously? Because I imagine it's a long time away from the piano.
I'll tell one story, and that was when my original journey across the United States. I was going through Montana, and my friend Jack Gladstone, who you saw up on the screen, said, "Oh yeah, I'm performing a gig for the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act. It's going to be in this little small, you might be passing by," and I passed by on the day that it was happening, and I traded my bicycle seat for a piano bench because I performed Jack shows before and got up on stage in my biking gear and played a set with him. And so yeah, I've gotten to do that every once in a while. Yeah.
Okay. I'm sure Jordan will stick around for a few minutes afterwards if you have questions for him, but in concept of time, I just wanted to highlight something that we have coming up next week. We have a few outside speakers that are coming in, and they'll be doing presentations over 2 days, and there are also some classroom spots available if you're a faculty member and are looking for a connection for your class. But we'll have Cindy Gonzalez, Nicholas Tangen, and Eric LeCompte here. And all of the programs are 4 o'clock and after, so hopefully you'll be able to attend or invite your students to attend. If you have questions or you want any contact to set up things for your class, please reach out to Roger or I. And thank you, George, so much for presenting today and summing up your decades of experiences and stories in a snapshot.
Thanks to the Benedict Institute as well, so appreciate it.